Good morning everyone, welcome to Our Small Footprint. My name is Nyssa, and if you're new here, we are a family of 8 who live off-grid in Australia. Today's video is a canning video. It's something that I've been really wanting to try and decided to give a go when I had a little bit of, spare time, kind of. And so I decided to film it while I was doing it to share it because it was the first time I'd done the process. And so if it was successful, then I could share that, but if it wasn't, then we could try and troubleshoot it together. So the first go, and it was successful, which was fantastic. So I'm going to give it another go. Not this week because I've got shopping this week, but probably next week, and I'm going to try a few different flavors, so I'll share that when I do it. But it's steamed pudding in a jar, in a water bath canner, basically. So I did a date and nut roll recipe, which is apparently an Australian sort of a standard thing, using dates pureed up with walnuts and things like that. I will put the recipe in the comments, and I'm going to post it on Facebook as well, because I posted a photo of this on Facebook and I've been meaning to come back and share the recipe, but I had to get this video done because I altered things a little bit while I was doing the video and I wanted to make sure that I got things right. So it's a date and nut, but I have seen recipes for self-saucing puddings and lemon puddings and things like that, so I really want to give a few more a go. So I decided to, as I said, film it to share it with you as I was doing it, and it worked out, which, worked wonderfully. But if it hadn't worked, I would have shared it anyway, and then I would have done it again and tried to get it to work. So come along and see how it went, and I will share the recipe and stuff as well, and then I will come back next time with more options that you can possibly do. So these jars will last, the theory is 6 to 12 months on a shelf, but I wouldn't be doing them as a long-term canning project anyway, more for a couple of months ahead, just as especially in winter. I think it'd be really nice to do this, and you could warm them up and have them for dessert on a winter night when you're already inside by like 5 o'clock because it's so cold. So that would be kind of nice. So come along and see what I got done. So there were quite a few different recipes floating around for this. A lot of them were in the Fowler's Vicola group. I don't actually process my jars using the Fowler's method, which is with a thermostat and running your water at 100 degrees instead of at a rolling boil. It's all just a little bit too complicated for me and my situation. Some people have electric units that automatically thermostat. Some people use a stovetop unit with a thermometer in it that helps to maintain that temperature and all that sort of thing. I find just running things at a rolling boil is the simplest method for me, and so that's what I do. So I didn't process them in the Fowler's method. I processed them in a standard water bath with the water over the top of the lids. There was quite a few different versions of the recipe around. So what I did was I went into the Fowler's group. Some people who'd had success had screenshotted recipes, and there was a link to one, so I'll put the link to one in the comments as well. And then I just sort of combined them based on what I know about baking as to how I wanted it to turn out. So I reduced the sugar in one of them, and I reduced the flour in one, but one had chocolate chips and I didn't want chocolate chips, so I added walnuts, which was the other recipe, and I just interchanged them a little bit and decided that this was what was going to work for me. There is lots of recipes floating around for different flavors and varieties, so I'm definitely going to give some more a go. Self-saucing puddings, lemon puddings, things like that. I think it'd be just a really neat thing to have on the shelf, especially with the kids, so that we don't do dessert every night, mostly because it's too much effort. It's not that I have an issue with dessert. If they eat their dinner, they're welcome to have fruit after dinner anyway, but it's more just that it's effort. So having something like this would be nice, but also for morning teas and afternoon teas as well. I managed to cut the jar into 8 pieces quite easily for the 8 of us to have a small slice. A bit of ghee on it or anything like that would be nice. Butter if you have butter and stuff, so it worked out well. Apparently you can do fruit, like Christmas puddings, in these as well. And the Christmas puddings take 3 hours of processing though, because of it's a steamed pudding in a jar, basically. So Christmas puddings take quite a while to cook, whereas these are more like, I want to say it's more like a sticky date pudding, this particular one, and they take less time to cook through. They're not as dense. The fruit cakes have lots of that fruit and stuff, so they're a much denser cake, so it needs that 3 hours of processing time to cook all the way through, but also to become shelf stable as well. So these ones are 90 minutes processing time, which is still a fair while, so you do want to make sure you got a whole canner full because you're going to a lot of effort to do it. The recipe involves a few different steps. So this is a predominantly date and nut roll, this particular one. So you want to soak your dates first. So it's 1.5 cups of dates. I did weigh this out, and I have notes with weight, so when I put it in the comments, I'll put weights and notes as to what I used. But it's 1.5 cups of dates, and you want to cover them with boiling water and the sugar and the bicarb and your fats. So I didn't have any brown sugar, so I just used raw sugar and a really generous drizzle of molasses because I really like the flavour. Then a teaspoon of bicarb per batch. So 1.5 cups is a batch of this batter, and that only fills 2 jars. So I did a double batch. So I doubled all of this. 30 grams of butter, but obviously we don't use butter, so I just used olive oil. So you mix the boiling water with the dates and those few ingredients, and you let it sit for a while to soften up those dates, like you do for anything that you're making with dates, that you want them all softened up. Once they were softened up, then I blitzed them. So now, obviously, I used my Thermomix because that was just simple. I could weigh it all into the Thermomix, pour the boiling water over, and let it sit, put the bowl aside. I've got 2 bowls, so that bowl got put aside while I used the secondary bowl for doing other things. So I just poured it all into the Thermomix bowl so I wasn't dirtying another container, and let it sit until it came back to sort of room temperature, because you're going to add egg. So you don't want to be adding an egg while the mixture is too hot, because you're going to scramble the egg in the mixture. So once the temperature came back down to sort of room temperature, like you can stick your finger in it, then I put it back on the Thermomix and I added the egg. 1 egg per batch, so I added 2. So I put the egg in there and I blitzed that up too, so that it was more of a thin batter then from that point forward. After that, you need to fold in your flour. So it's 1.5 cups of plain flour. I did a double batch, which ends up about 450 grams of plain flour. Again, I'll try and remember to put nice detailed notes in the bottom, or I'll do it really detailed on Facebook and then share the link to that. I'll see how I go. But so I used 450 grams of the plain flour and then folded it through. So I used the Thermomix, I put it on speed 5 for 5 seconds just to give it a good whiz, and then I used a spatula afterwards. You also add 2 teaspoons of baking powder, a pinch of salt, and 1/2 cup of your mixed-ins. So I used crushed walnuts. I just crushed them up a bit in my hand before I put them in, but the Thermomix would have crushed them up a little bit as well. You can use whatever you want here. So I'd imagine you could swap out some of the plain flour for cacao and make it sort of chocolate flavored. Still going to have that hint of molasses, gingerbready flavor with the chocolate, but that would probably be quite nice as well. And then you could add your chocolate chips. So you'd have like a double chocolate pudding. That sounds nice. I may have to try that one. But so there's going to be a lot of variation. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to try and fiddle with this and make a few more. Such a drama to have to try all these cakes. I tell you, the kids will hate it. So with this particular one, there was one recipe that used mixed spice as the add-in, as a flavor add-in as well. I didn't put the mixed spice in because I didn't want to overpower the flavors of the brown sugar, molasses, and walnuts. I wanted it to be a fairly mild sort of a flavor, especially for first go, to make sure that the kids liked it and things like that. Because I did a double batch, as I said, it fit into 4 31s. So 31s are a 850ml size, I believe, and it fit halfway. The batter fit halfway up on 4 of those jars for this double batch. So it's a single batch would normally be a loaf, I suppose. So you're splitting a loaf into 2, which isn't a bad portion sizing. That's giving you 2, like you only open 1 jar at a time. So you're splitting that loaf into 2 different ones and then splitting it into portions, which is kind of a good way to do it, because if I make a whole loaf of something, then the kids tend to eat the entire loaf of it because they can. When it came to putting them into the jars, there was a bit of a learning curve here. So most things that I read said that you grease the jars with butter. Obviously we don't use butter, so the first one that I did spray with a bit of olive oil on the inside of the jar before putting the batter in. I used a funnel in the hopes that you're sort of getting the batter to go into the middle of the jar without sliding down the sides, which seemed to work quite well. But the batter, if you've ever made like sticky date puddings and things like that, because it's got the bicarb and stuff in it, it's kind of a fluffy sort of a batter, so it's a little hard to maneuver and handle, really. So it took a little bit of juggling, and so what I tried to do was I tried to get it evenly in the 4 jars, knowing that it would fit the 4 jars about the halfway mark. Used a spatula to sort of push it down so that it was nice and firm in the bottom of the jar, no air pockets. And then I washed the spatula to try and slide down the sides any sort of batter that had gone down the sides as well. So I wanted to slide to make sure that the sides of the jars had as little batter as possible, because that's going to cook first. Like if you got really thin streaks of batter on the sides of the jars, that's going to cook before the rest of the cake can rise up to meet it. Well, that's how I theorize it anyway. I don't know if that's accurate, but to me, that's how the theory would work. No different than in a cake tin. If you've got bits of batter on the edge of the cake tin, it cooks and burns before the rest of the cake has a chance to rise into it and allow it to cook as a whole. So I wanted to try and make sure that the edges of the jars were as clean as possible. So I washed my spatula a few times to try and do that. I did forget to grease the jars after the first one. So I did put a little bit of olive oil in the top half of the jars after I had finished them, just to see if it was needed or whatever else. But there is oil in the batter, so theoretically it's a little bit non-stick anyway, because there's oil in the batter. And if you use Pyrex cooking dishes and stuff, you will find that they tend to stick a whole lot less than like aluminium dishes as well. So glass itself is mildly non-stick as well. I think it all helps in that. And it's a steamed pudding, which means it's letting out steam and moisture, which when it cooks, the cake sort of pulls away from the sides of the jars as well. So, you know, there's a lot of things going on here that are helping to maintain that non-stick aspect, that I'm not entirely sure whether the greasing of the jars is needed or not. And I have no way of knowing which jars I did end up greasing, the single jar that I did end up greasing, and the other ones either I didn't mark it or anything, because it's going in a water bath, so you can't really keep a mark there. So I have no idea if it made a difference or not. Anyway, filled them all, smushed them down, cleaned the edges of the glass, and then I did the normal. So we're going to wipe the edges of the rims of the jar with white vinegar to make sure that there's no batter stuck around the edges of the jar. Make sure you do that well, because any batter will interfere with the seal in the jar. So these are Fowler's Vicola jars, so they have a rubber ring that goes around the rims, much like the lid works for a ball mason. Now, on that note, any straight-sided jar should work. So long as it's a jar that you would normally water bath can in for an extended period of time, because this is a 90-minute processing time, and it has straight sides, any jar should work. So a wide mouth pint jar should work, but you would get more out of this batter in a wide mouth pint jar because it's less capacity. So they're only 500 odd mils and these are 850 mils. So you want to fill it to about halfway of whatever the size jar that you have, so long as it's a nice straight-sided jar. If the jar is not straight-sided, you're going to have more issues with popping the cake out, but you're also going to have a discrepancy between what halfway is, because like if the jar has a tapered shape where it is wider at the bottom and thinner at the top, then there is less capacity at the top of the jar than there is at the bottom. So a straight-sided jar, halfway on a straight-sided jar, whichever jar you use, is the theory that will work for the right amount of cake batter to rise into the jar without pushing against the lid. So this did not have any contact with the lid at all once it was done. So, squirrel. So clean the rims of the jars really well with white vinegar and put your rubber rings on. I wipe over the rubber rings as well, just in case I had anything on my hands. And then the Fowlers have stainless steel reusable lids, and I wipe the inside of them out with vinegar as well. They are washed, but I like to wipe everything out with vinegar. Anyone who's watched any of my canning videos has seen me do it, and it's because we live somewhere that's dirty and dusty and gross. So even if things are kept in containers, they get washed and pulled out on the bench, and there's a chance of there to be dust in them. I just find it comforting for myself to wipe everything out with vinegar as I'm using it. Then I put the clip on. So Fowler's jars have the clips instead of rings. Put a clip onto each jar. So the jars are still warm because that batter was warm from the boiling water and date mix. So what I want to do is then bring the canning water up to the same temperature as the jars. So I filled the canner and then brought it up to, like, I felt the water and made sure that it was on par with the temperature of the jars, because you should always put the jars into the same temperature water so that you don't have any chance of thermal shock. Once the jars are in there, there's a lot of air in these jars, so the jars did not want to stay under the level of the water. So what I did was I put my second canning rack, so there's a canning rack in the bottom that the jars sit on, and this is my second rack so that I can double stack things on top of the jars, and then I put a canning jar full of water on top of that to weigh it down. So that's going to keep those jars underneath the level of the water until they have processed long enough that the air's gone out. So it won't take long of them processing when the air will go out of the jars, because that's the whole process of what we're doing is we're canning, we're removing oxygen. So as the oxygen is leaving the jars, they won't float. They will become heavy enough to stay down by themselves. But in the meantime, this rack will help to keep them under the water level whilst they start cooking. You then bring the canner up to a full rolling boil like you do for any sort of water bath canning, and you're going to process these for 90 minutes. So it's quite a lengthy processing time, which is why I said before that I think I would definitely make sure to do a full canning load. And I may even run both canners at the same time and potentially double batches. There was no siphoning whatsoever in this sort of a thing, so you could reuse the water and it would already be hot. So if I ran a whole day of running them, but I do want to try quite a few different flavors, so that might be what I'll do. Is I'll spend a day doing it. I'll start in the morning, make the first batch, put them in. While that's going for the 90 minutes, I'll make the next batch of dough ready to go in once that water cools off the boil a little bit, and put the next batch in. That way I'm getting the most use out of the water. You can't steam can these. Like, the theory behind water bath canning and steam canning means that you should be able to steam can them, but you can only run a steam canner for 40 minutes at a maximum. That's the maximum quantity of processing time because of the limited amount of water that's in a steam canner. So you can't process these in a steam canner. That would be really convenient, but you can't. So making the most water bath canning in this size jars means there's a lot of water used, and I'd really like to make the most of that water usage. So to do that, I'd like to reuse the water. But in our environment, I can't leave that water sitting overnight. Even with a lid on it, the heat, the temperature, the bugs, it's a no-go. So I don't ever reuse my canning water if it's not reused same day. It waters the plants, which is fine, but water is a precious resource here, so it would be really nice to run like a whole day of it using the same water, so long as there was no siphoning in the water, which with these cakes, as I said, there wasn't any siphoning because the cakes, the batter's really thick. It's not like it can escape the jars particularly easily, so long as you don't overfill them, I'm guessing. So 90 minutes at a rolling boil, and once you've done your 90 minutes, then turn the canner off, let the water sit for 5 or 10 minutes like normal to come off the boil a little bit with the jar still in it, and then remove the jars and put them on a board to cool for 24 hours. Like anything, you want to let it sit for 24 hours untouched, and then at the end of the 24 hours, then you check the seal. Now, it's cake and it's a brand new thing, and I wanted to make this video, so I couldn't wait till the next day. So the jars were cool to touch by the time I did this, but I decided that I was going to open one. So I opened a jar and was a little unsure of how it was going to go. I did grab a knife in case I needed to run it around the edge of the jars, just in case there was a need for me to scrape it out. I did contemplate the fact that if you want to eat it out with a spoon, then that would work too, but in the end, all I did was I tipped the jar upside down and gave it some jiggles, some fairly forceful jiggles, but some jiggles, and it just slid out. So I have no idea whether this one was the oiled one or not, because I've got no way to tell, but I don't think it was. I don't think it made any difference. When you look at the jars after processing, they all have some of that cake batter look on the outside, but all the jars have the cake pulling away from the sides of the jars, which is what you want to look for a cooked cake. All of them, well, I haven't opened the rest of them, but this one has domed really nicely inside the jar, but hasn't reached the lid, which is what you're aiming for, that dome like a normal cake, but not hitting the height of the lid, because you're trying to get a mostly full jar, not a full jar. And it slid out. It was amazing. So I sliced it up for everyone to try, and everyone really, really liked it. So the texture of the cake is very much like any sort of steamed pudding, a sticky date pudding, anything like that. It has that moist stickiness to the outside and the spongy internal, but very slightly dense, but not. It's still spongy. It's still as very much like a sticky date pudding. It's got that density to it, but it is a nice mouthful. It still melts in the mouth. Sticky on the outside, very moist. That date caramel flavour is delicious. I like caramel date flavour. And I opened my last box of dates to make this, so I'll have to remember to grab some more at Costco. Costco sells a box of seeded dates. They're not medjool. They do sell medjool dates sometimes, but they're a little out of my price range most of the time. But they have a box of dates that I use for this. They're a 3 kilo box, and I think they're like $15. It's a wonderful price. So if I'll grab some again this month if they've got them, and try a few different things. I still think using that dates as a base is a good way to do it, but I am going to try some self-sourcing puddings and stuff, and they don't have dates as the base either. I did think my whole orange and almond cake that I make would lend itself well to this, because the texture of that cake is very similar to this sort of thing, so I might give that a go as well. I have plenty of jars of oranges on my shelf still that I haven't used yet, just because I haven't got around to it. So I have all those jars of oranges that I boiled, pureed, and put in jars so that I can make whole orange and almond cake without having to boil the oranges first. So I might try a couple of variations. You know, there's whole orange cakes that use flour as a base. The one that I normally make has no flour in it. It's flourless with almond meal, which is kind of heavy. I'm not real sure. That doesn't have much of a rise to it, so I'm unsure. It probably would need more than half a jar full. It's something that I'm going to have to experiment with. Now, the only thing is that by experimenting, I'm using rings. But because it's cake, I'm kind of thinking that I might reuse some of my rings to do this, because if they fail, it's not that big a deal, because it's experimenting anyway, and the kids will eat it. So I'm probably going to hold on to all the rings that I use to make these cakes, and I'm going to reuse those rings for the following cakes. And if they seal, fantastic. If they don't, then they'll get eaten. It's not that big a deal. But especially while I'm experimenting, the idea of using so many rings are so expensive at the moment. The rubber rings for the fowlers and the lids for ball mason. It's just, I can't get any lids for the ball mason at the moment at all. I need to order some more for jars. 4 jars ones off Amazon, but it's just so expensive that I keep on putting it off. The Fowler's rings are a little easier to get. They used to be available at Mitre 10, but Mitre 10 has like doubled their prices, so I can buy them online, but the shipping is quite high, so I need to do a bulk order to make it worthwhile, and with the car and everything else, I just haven't had the funds lately. So I am running low on rings and lids at the moment, so that's a bit of an issue. I did buy a whole lot of new lug lids for my lug lid jars, and that's great, but I can't use those jars for the cakes because they aren't straight-sided. So a bit of a juggle at the moment with jars. Plenty of jars, not so many of the rubber rings or ball mason lids or anything like that, but we will get there in the end. So I will bring you along for the experiments too. I might do a whole day of it and film that whole day, do a whole bunch of different flavors, and then we can do a taste test of a bunch of them as well. So hopefully that helped anyone who has been like, I've been eyeing the idea of this off for ages, and I just have gone, I don't know, but I definitely think it's worth the effort. I think that you don't intend it to be long term, so it's, you know, it's cake. Like, that only made 4 cakes. That's only 4 days of snacks, and say even if you only have one a week, that's only 4 weeks. So it's not like it's going to be on a shelf as a long-term thing, but I definitely think it's kind of nifty, and we don't have much freezer space, so this means that there's this idea of a dessert or a cake or something that I can say, I really just feel like something sweet, and I can grab it off the shelf. So some people do cheesecakes and stuff in them too. I don't know how. Cheesecakes, you can make a big cheesecake and each piece can be sealed up and frozen pretty easily, and it takes next to nothing to defrost, so that's probably not something that I would go to the effort of doing. But the cakes, definitely, that whole steamed texture is a wonderful thing. So thanks for joining me again today, and I will see you again in the next couple of days. Thanks, guys.